Hey, my friend, just Jordan here. I thought it'd be way easier for me to make a video than to send you an email. So I wanted to respond to your email to talk through a couple things that you talk about, and I think you raise some important questions, because I think one of the questions that comes out of the text is, when Jesus says, if you don't forgive, I won't forgive you. And then all throughout, I don't know if you saw where I hitched that Matthew part and the other pieces from the Gospels in Luke, where Jesus reemphasizes this: if you don't forgive, I won't forgive you. And I think one of the tensions of the story, right? So I think one of the deals you talked about was you're really curious. It doesn't seem to talk about forgiveness. It talks about canceled debt, but it doesn't mean he doesn't actually say forgive in the parable. And that actually the Greek word in canceled debt is that word forgive. Forgive is rooted in that Greek word, so it's wrapped up in the context of that. So I would say that. So there is this understanding that God really does, he forgives this first man. And so I think your question of, so does forgiveness get rescinded or not? And because it seems like with Jesus' tough words that potentially forgiveness can be rescinded if we choose to not forgive. And what does that have to do? What I hear at the root of your question being, what do we do with the once saved, always saved, and security of our, the security of our salvation? And I think what I would come back to is when we're teaching scripture, right? So I think the scripture, the once saved, always saved, is obviously rooted in different places of scripture, of like, we can't be snatched. You can't be snatched from the Lord. And that part of that comes from that Romans 9, where the Lord, the gifts and the call of the Lord are irrevocable. So you have lots of these bits, and so it seems like these two things are counter. And I think what I would say, in light of the wrestle that you're having, and in light of the wrestle that I think the scripture gives, is like, I think both can be true, and yet they seem to be true on different levels. So I guess what I'm getting at is this. My question would be, can you really be a follower of Jesus? Can you really be a follower of Jesus and not be someone who forgives your brother or your sister? And so what I would say is forgiveness, I don't think it wipes away God's forgiveness for you, because actually God has forgiven all of us. And I think Dan would say this. Dan said that everyone's been forgiven. The question is whether or not we choose to accept and own the forgiveness that's been given to us. And when we accept and own the forgiveness that's been given to us and become a follower of Jesus, that means that we've submitted all these other areas in our life. And this bit of unforgiveness is part of the package, is that we're expected to forgive. So I would say, so when you talk about, so then is the sin of unforgiveness unforgivable? I think, the tension I have with that is that I don't know if you can actually truly have your life submitted to Jesus and hold a posture of unforgiveness towards your neighbor. So my question would be, are you actually in the first place? So that would be one of my questions, and I would think about just goes around with the narrow road analogy of like the path is narrow with the Lord. I think the other thing that I'm thinking about as I have read your email is, is Jesus as black and white as that, of like, hey, you had a little bit of unforgiveness, so I'm taking away your salvation. I don't think that's how Jesus is. So I think when we look at his character, gracious and compassionate, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, and yet holding us accountable for our sin. And we're going to get the same God when we come to Judgment Day. And so I don't think we can expect to get this God who all of a sudden pulls the wool over our eyes and then says, sorry, you don't get in because you had this poor posture. So I don't think we're going to get a different Jesus. What I do think we need to be careful of is when we come to a passage like this where the language is very intense and God he's talking, and we also have to remember that we're dealing with a parable here, and yet Jesus does make the statement, this is how God will treat you if you don't forgive your brother or sister from your heart. This is a serious matter as followers of Jesus, and so it's not something that we want to play around with. And it's something that if we're going to follow Jesus, that we need to submit and surrender ourselves to it. So we want to take this very seriously. And yet, I think at the same time, how judgment will be for us, we're not going to get a different Jesus than the Jesus we have in the scriptures. And so there's tension there of, I think sometimes we talk like black or white. Like if I have unforgiveness in my heart, does that mean that my salvation's rescinded? I think that what Jesus would say to that is this: don't let that be the obstacle for you. Make sure your heart's in a place where you're surrendered and submitted to me, and your posture is to be one of forgiveness. Focus on that. Don't focus on what the what ifs are. Now, I think, so it can create some uncertainty for us, but I think we take confidence in who Jesus is, who he says he is, how he follows through, and then we do everything on our end to make sure our lives are right before the Lord in every area. So I think it's a good question. I think it's a wrestle. I wouldn't be, I think part of my bit of like when we come to Judgment Day, I think it's really hard for us to take a firm stand and say, this is exactly how it's going to be. If you have a hint of unforgiveness, you're out. The God that I see throughout the scriptures is less concerned about that question and more concerned about our current reality. Is our lives postured in a way to surrender to Jesus? And let that be the emphasis instead of us getting all worked up about the end. But I think there's some ramblings for me. Maybe you could make me a quick little video, and we could go back and forth on my initial thoughts. Okay, thanks, Larry.